The first surviving account of the White Harbor Hotel does not come from its owners, nor from the society pages that once praised it as the Atlantic's brightest jewel of 1904. It comes instead from a letter written by a housekeeper named Margaret Ellery, dated July 17th of that same year, discovered decades later inside a municipal archive box mislabeled Harbor Infrastructure. Her handwriting is tense, the pen strokes uneven. She describes the hotel as too quiet for a place so full, a line that would make little sense until the photograph resurfaced in the 1970s, an image that appeared ordinary at first glance, but carried a detail historians still struggle to explain. The hotel had been built on a lonely stretch of the New England coastline, where storms rolled in without warning, and the sea clawed at the bluffs. Its investors envisioned a retreat for the wealthy, far from the congested cities rising to the south. The hotel's white timber cladding gleamed in the sun, and its steep gables were meant to resemble the grand seaside estates of Newport. But the land itself had a reputation long before the first nail was driven. Locals claimed the tides were unpredictable, the ground unstable, and the wind so relentless that even seasoned fishermen avoided anchoring nearby. None of this mattered to the businessmen who believed luxury alone could tame a landscape. By the summer of 1904, the hotel had been open for barely 6 weeks. Guests arrived with heavy trunks, starched collars, and the stiff posture of people accustomed to being observed. Yet staff testimony from the era reveals a growing unease. Doors were found unlocked after being checked, guest complaints about cold drafts in sealed rooms multiplied, and several workers requested reassignment to the laundry wing simply to avoid what they described as the long corridor on the west side, especially near dusk. That corridor is the same one visible in the now infamous photograph. In it, the veranda stretches outward with a kind of forced elegance, the ocean behind it roiling in the distance. A cluster of guests stands on the wooden decking, 2 women in high-collared dresses, a man in a straw boater, and another leaning on a cane as though exhausted by the climb from the shore. Their faces are blurred by the long exposure, giving them an almost reluctant presence as if the camera borrowed them rather than captured them. Everything in the image feels typical for the era except for the single quiet anomaly in the upper right window. Historians have studied that window obsessively. At first it appears to hold nothing more than a shadow, perhaps an underdeveloped smear on the original plate. But closer inspection reveals a shape that seems deliberate. Shoulders too sharply angled, a head positioned just slightly off-center, a form that mirrors a human stance without matching human proportions. The earliest researchers dismissed it as a simple optical illusion. Yet letters from staff members, including Ellery, reference that same window on multiple occasions, describing a watcher whose presence they could feel but never fully see. In her letter, Ellery notes that certain rooms in the West Wing had been sealed off before guests ever checked in. She writes of linens delivered but never used, of furniture arranged and then locked away, and of a manager who insisted the wing was structurally unsafe despite the building passing inspection only days earlier. The contradiction is striking. Even more unsettling is her description of a child's voice, soft, rhythmic, and distinctly out of place, heard late at night drifting along the hallway outside those closed rooms. Although no official record mentions missing children or previous occupants, shipping manifests from the region list several unaccompanied minors transported through nearby ports during the winter before the hotel opened. Their destinations were never specified, and no subsequent records trace their whereabouts. For decades, the connection seemed speculative at best, but the shadow in the photograph, captured in perfect alignment with the sealed West Wing, reignited questions that had been ignored for nearly a century. Some claim the figure is nothing more than a trick of light bouncing off imperfect glass. Others argue it is evidence of the hotel's darker purpose, one tied to institutions and programs that operated in secrecy under the guise of charitable reform. What remains undeniable is that the photograph was not staged, and its photographer, a Boston newspaper man named Henry Caldwell, never mentioned noticing anyone in that window. His notes described the weather, the guests, the quality of the afternoon light, nothing more. And perhaps that is what makes the image so unsettling. A moment meant to celebrate luxury instead preserved a fragment of something the hotel worked hard to hide. The figure in the window is neither moving nor blurred. It is steady, intentional, present in a way that none of the guests on the veranda seem to be, as if it was the only one aware that the shutter had just opened. When Henry Caldwell developed the glass plate from that June afternoon, he was not searching for mysteries. He was fulfilling a commission for a Boston travel magazine eager to promote the rise of luxury tourism along the Atlantic coast. His notes from the assignment, preserved in a bundle of envelopes found among his personal effects, reflect a man who valued precision over imagination. Yet after the photograph circulated among editors, Caldwell was quietly asked to return to the hotel to clarify an architectural inconsistency in the West Wing. He refused. His reply was one sentence long. There was no inconsistency during my visit. That refusal marked the beginning of a silence he maintained until his death. In the weeks following the photo's publication, the White Harbor Hotel's management attempted to downplay concerns raised by readers who claimed the shadowed figure looked unnatural or watchful. Newspapers printed curt editorials reminding audiences that photography in 1904 was hardly an exact science. Blurred figures, distortions, and odd reflections were common. But privately, according to later testimonies from descendants of the staff, the hotel's leadership held several closed-door meetings addressing visibility issues concerning the West Wing. No minutes from these meetings survive, but the sudden decision to relocate guests from that section of the building suggests an urgency at odds with their public reassurances. To understand why the West Wing mattered so much, historians examined the hotel's original blueprints. These proved difficult to obtain. The surviving copies were incomplete, water-damaged, and missing several sections related to internal circulation. What remained revealed an unsettling detail: a narrow sequence of rooms behind the guest suites, accessible only through a service stairwell that did not appear on promotional maps. These compartments were cramped, windowless, and built with inexpensive timber, an odd contrast to the opulence shown elsewhere. Their purpose was never listed. More troubling was the discovery that these rooms connected directly to the very window where the silhouette appeared. Theories emerged over time, some more credible than others. One of the most persistent involves the child welfare initiatives quietly implemented in several coastal states during the early 1900s. These programs, often underfunded and poorly supervised, relocated children from impoverished urban neighborhoods to rural institutions and private facilities. Official records cited education, moral upbringing, and vocational training as their goals. Unofficial accounts suggest a different reality: overcrowding, corporal punishment, and forced labor disguised as practical instruction. Facilities that failed to meet state guidelines sometimes partnered with private businesses to offset operational costs. Boarding houses, textile mills, and even hotels occasionally entered these arrangements under the pretense of charitable support. Local archivists uncovered a list of institutions licensed to receive these children, and while the White Harbor Hotel was not named explicitly, an entity called the Harbor Improvement Society appeared on the same registry. The society had no known headquarters, no known board members, and no traceable financial filings. The only address associated with it was a post office box in the nearest town, opened just 2 months before the hotel began construction. Given the sparse regulatory oversight of the era, it is entirely plausible that children were relocated under the society's authority and housed temporarily in the hotel's unfinished service rooms. Many researchers point to Ellery's letter as the strongest supporting evidence. She never names the children directly, but her references to small footsteps behind locked doors and bundles carried in after dusk suggest activities incompatible with a functioning luxury hotel. She describes being instructed to avoid the service stairwell, to deliver food to the manager's office instead of the assigned quarters, and to keep her observations within domestic boundaries. These euphemisms align with the language used at the time to pressure household employees into silence. The silence held until the night of August 9th, when a storm struck the coastline with enough force to damage several porches and flood the basement. Surviving hotel records, sparse as they are, indicate the West Wing suffered the worst of it. A collapsed ceiling, buckled beams, and several rooms rendered inaccessible. Guests were escorted to carriages and urged to leave before sunrise. The hotel closed for repairs but never reopened. In the aftermath, contractors were hired to dismantle sections of the damaged structure, and with them vanished any physical evidence of what those interior rooms contained. Yet the photograph endured, not because it was the last image taken before the storm, but because it captured the silent occupant in that upper right window. An occupant whose presence no one acknowledged during the hotel's brief and troubled existence, and whose story began to unravel only after the building fell into ruin. For decades after the storm sealed the White Harbor Hotel's fate, the building lingered in silence, a skeleton of weather-beaten timber and empty rooms that locals avoided even in daylight. Children dared one another to run up the cracked veranda steps, but no one lingered near the west wing where the boards sagged and the narrow windows stared blankly toward the sea. The land became state property in the 1930s, then fell into bureaucratic limbo as coastal surveys and lighthouse projects shifted priority. Only one surveyor, a civil engineer named Robert Alton, left behind notes describing the collapsed interior. His writing is sparse, but certain phrases stand out. Small shelving at knee height, rusted iron brackets unsuitable for guest use, and partition spacing too narrow for standard storage. These details would later support the theory that the wing contained makeshift living quarters, rooms intended not for travelers, but for individuals who were never meant to be seen. Alton also mentions discovering fragments of fabric embedded in the debris, pieces too small to identify but patterned in a way that resembled institutional clothing common in state-run homes for dependent children. He submitted the samples to his supervisor, but the only reply he received was an instruction to omit any reference to non-structural findings from the final survey. The omission became another loose thread in a mystery that was steadily expanding, pulled forward by those who refused to believe the silhouette in the photograph was accidental. By the 1950s, coastal redevelopment plans revived interest in the property. A proposal to build a modern resort required clearing the remaining foundations, and workers began dismantling what little remained of the hotel. Among them was a carpenter named Saul Jenkins, whose oral history was recorded in the 1980s by a regional heritage society. Jenkins recalled entering the west wing during the demolition and finding a section of wall concealed behind warped floor planks. Behind it lay a narrow crawl space containing a row of iron hooks, all mounted at uniform height. The hooks were too low for coats and too widely spaced for tools. Jenkins believed they were meant for lanterns or buckets until he noticed the faint outline of chalk markings above them, tallies grouped in sets of 5. He assumed they were construction notes. Only years later, after learning about child labor in early 20th century institutions, did he question whether the markings represented days, individuals, or something else entirely. What unsettled Jenkins most was a small wooden box wedged into a corner of the crawl space. Inside were 3 objects: a worn leather shoe small enough for a young child, a folded scrap of paper containing only the initials H.E., and a hand-carved token resembling a ferry ticket. The initials would seem unremarkable if not for the fact that Margaret Ellery, the housekeeper whose letter had first hinted at something hidden in the West Wing, signed her correspondence as M. Ellery, and mentioned a sibling named Henry who had died in childhood. Whether the initials referred to him or to one of the children possibly housed in the hotel remains unproven. The token, however, drew particular scrutiny from historians, as it matched the style used by several philanthropic transport programs at the turn of the century, programs that relocated children without always documenting their final destinations. By the time Jenkins considered reporting his finding, the demolition was complete, and the crawl space had been reduced to rubble. The wooden box, fearing ridicule, he kept in a drawer for years before passing it to a local librarian, who eventually donated it anonymously to a maritime museum. The museum cataloged it without context, unaware that its contents aligned with a growing body of circumstantial evidence, indicating the hotel may have been used as a temporary holding site for children relocated through unofficial channels. As researchers revisited the photograph in light of the demolition accounts, the figure in the upper right window took on new meaning. The silhouette no longer resembled a simple shadow, but a presence occupying the exact position where internal blueprints suggested the service rooms converged. It appeared too centered, too sharply defined, and too deliberate to dismiss. More importantly, its posture seemed to convey something the rest of the photograph did not: an awareness of the camera, a stillness that suggested waiting rather than movement. If the guests below were unaware of being photographed, the figure above looked as though it had been expecting it. Interest in the White Harbor Hotel resurfaced in the 1970s, when a regional historian, Clara Worthing, unearthed Caldwell's photograph while cataloging forgotten negatives for a coastal preservation grant. She had no particular reason to examine it closely, until the faint figure in the West Wing window caught her attention. Worthing enlarged the image repeatedly, expecting the silhouette to dissolve into blur. Instead, the shape sharpened. The rigid shoulders, the slight tilt of the head, the oddly compressed proportions. It all suggested a body standing too still, too centered, and too intentionally aligned with the shadows behind it. What troubled her most was not the figure's presence, but the unmistakable impression that it was positioned there before the shutter opened, as though waiting to be seen. Worthing spent 2 years tracing municipal records, interviewing descendants of former staff, and piecing together the scattered fragments left behind by demolition crews and surveyors. She discovered that the Harbor Improvement Society, the mysterious entity linked to the hotel's construction, existed only for a brief 16 months. Its financial filings ceased abruptly after the storm of 1904. Postal records indicated that every letter sent to its box number was forwarded to a private office belonging to a state inspector, later dismissed for procedural misconduct. His name appeared in several inquiries related to the mismanagement of child relocation programs, though none resulted in conviction. The state closed his personnel file soon after his resignation, leaving behind an administrative silence that mirrored the hotel's own erasure. Compiling these loose threads, Worthing concluded that the West Wing had likely served as an unofficial intake site for children in transit. Young individuals shuffled between institutions with minimal oversight. Hidden rooms, concealed passageways, nightly deliveries, restricted stairwells, and a workforce pressured into silence all pointed toward a system that prioritized secrecy over welfare. Although she never located definitive documentation naming the hotel as a sanctioned facility, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Every unanswered question seemed to settle back onto the solitary silhouette staring from the window. In the 1980s, Worthing attempted to publish her findings in a historical journal, but editors dismissed the theory as interpretive speculation. Without government records or first-hand testimonies from surviving staff, the narrative remained incomplete. And yet the photograph continued to circulate in academic circles, each new scan revealing the same immutable figure in the window. A figure untouched by exposure decay or plate deterioration, as though frozen in perpetual vigilance. Photographic analysts noted that natural shadows typically dissipate into gradient tones over time. This one did not. Its edges held firm, its posture unchanging across every reproduction. It stood where no guest should have been, and displayed a stillness inconsistent with accidental motion. In her final recorded lecture, Worthing described the photograph not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as a witness to it. She argued that institutions built on silence often leave behind traces not in paper trails or testimonies, but in architectural absences, in rooms with no clear purpose, in stairwells that appear on no map, in windows that frame those who were never meant to be visible. The White Harbor Hotel, she said, was a structure designed for luxury, yet engineered with hidden intent. The silhouette, she believed, belonged to someone confined within that design, someone whose identity faded long before the hotel collapsed under wind and salt. Attempts to digitally enhance the image in the early 2000s produced mixed results. Some analysts claimed to see the faint outline of fabric consistent with institutional uniforms. Others argued the figure's proportions suggested malnutrition or prolonged confinement. No enhancement ever revealed a face. Instead, the darkness held, refusing to yield detail, as if the photograph carried an unspoken boundary protecting the figure's identity. Today, the site where the hotel stood is an overgrown bluff marked only by a weathered plaque referencing its brief period of operation. Nothing mentions the West Wing, the hidden rooms, or the unresolved questions surrounding the children possibly sheltered within its walls. But the photograph endures, its solitary watcher suspended in the upper right window, a reminder that even the most luxurious facades can conceal lives erased by neglect and bureaucratic convenience. The figure remains unmoving, its gaze fixed on a moment captured by accident, yet carrying the weight of a truth the hotel never intended the world to see.